Observer, and Peter Kaplan is one of those great legends in New York journalism circles. He is sort of a throwback to your classic, Jonah Jameson editor, and sort of, total all-around character. Peter Kaplan left the Observer after a change of ownership a couple of years ago. Two of his former editors, Jim Windolf and Peter Stevenson, were inspired enough by their old boss and friend to basically sort of create multiple online personalities for him. So today on the internet, there are essentially three Kaplans. There's Wise Kaplan and Cranky Kaplan, both creations of Jim and Peter. And then there's also Real Kaplan, who may or may not actually be Peter Kaplan. It's hard to tell. He's also started Premium Kaplan, which you can sign up for if you want premium access to content. All I know is that Real Kaplan started following me this morning, and I was a bit afraid. But this TED Talk was basically the creation of, I saw Wise Kaplan online several months ago, walking around feeling bad that he'd never won a major award or been asked to give a TED Talk. And so I offered him a chance to speak to ours. And so one of the great things about Wise Kaplan is that he is basically a storyteller. He is not just simply tweeting links or anything else that people use Twitter for, which is basically to promote themselves or point at content. But basically, he's invented sort of a new form of storytelling, a sort of complete world around Wise Kaplan. Cranky Kaplan, his sort of counterpart, speaks in all caps and is sort of a very aggressive sort of screamer. Wise Kaplan is a sort of interesting creation where he basically is sort of a weird throwback to that sort of New York City past. Like really, I know it's interesting, you can't see his background, but his background right now is Tony Curtis. And I always think that Wise Kaplan is a character who's sort of a leftover from the sweet smell of success, that sort of 1950s dirty town New York. So Wise Kaplan lives in Larchmont, one of the suburbs out there, drives an '82 Buick, sips bourbon on the dash. He commonly sees the ghost boys of 1901, two small pale lads that only he can see. His great heroes are Peter Bogdanovich, with whom he's permanently working on a screenplay, and also Warren Beatty. I guess we're going to have to update the tweets there. But basically, you can sort of see that Peter Kaplan is a sort of, creation that's sort of meant to evoke the sort of lost New York in New York journalism. And one of the things he periodically does. Sorry, Lisa, for tweeting. But basically, Wise Kaplan, one of the periodic things he does is give lessons in journalism, a sort of rapid-fire stream of tweets where he will sort of explicate sort of the things that have been learned. And Wise Kaplan can be, I will warn you, somewhat borderline profane and very fascinating. He likes to get naked a lot online, I can tell. But what's interesting to me is that, there's been a whole profusion of fake Twitter identities. So there's been Wise Kaplan was actually one of the first, but hardly one of the last. When a cobra escaped the Bronx Zoo a few months ago in New York, there was immediately a Escape Bronx Zoo cobra Twitter feed that got 20,000 followers almost instantly and was running around. And recently in New York, after Hurricane Irene, there was Mayor Bloomberg gave this fantastic press conference where he tried to warn the city's residents in Spanish. And his Spanish was so awful, it quickly inspired Miguel Blumbito on Twitter, who really sort of like shouted warnings in mangled Spanish. And perhaps the most famous one actually is fake Mayor Emanuel up in Chicago, who recently, who basically started a whole series of profane tweets during his campaign and transition. And basically wrote a whole book about it. And the book party was held at the Hideout in Chicago last week. And the real Mayor Emanuel actually came, shocking everybody who was there, including one of our speakers this afternoon, John Tolva, the CTO of Chicago, who's DJing. It's a little awkward when your boss shows up at a party for a book that's designed to mock him. So basically, the real Mayor Emanuel showed up, and the best part is he wrote, I think the book is something like, the effing wisdom of Mayor Emanuel. And he wrote in the author's book, you are an expletive, Mayor Emanuel. So you can sort of see, here, and I'm hoping he's warming up. We're starting to hit his stride now, and now we're in lessons for journalism. So I will let Kaplan take it away from here, and we'll see what wisdom he has to impart for us. Thank you very much. One addendum to this. What's really interesting about Wise Kaplan, too, is that there's actually both of them tweet for him. I find it really interesting. It's a tag team sort of effort in creating this personality, and the two continually, Jim Windolf and Peter Stevenson, continually sort of swap out, and they're sort of constantly sort of filling in as a hive mind, which is interesting because it's that classic sort of notion of journalism and identity. How do you create a voice for a character? How do you sort of fill out what he is? And so yeah, so as far as I know, both of them are tweeting this. I think Stevenson's at work and can't watch the live stream, but hopefully they're firing it up. I don't think so. They should be. I told them to simply fire away. So I'm going to follow up and sort of goad him right now on my phone. This is the beauty, the sort of interactivity of this. I wish there was some sort of AV track that we could play. Perhaps something from the 1950s would be about apropos of based on the character. But that's oddly appropriate. And it's sort of interesting, one of the things I signed up for this is, and I've been joking to Will, my friend Will Leach here, that there's a good possibility that I'll be thrown out of the conference at lunch because I actually have no idea actually what they'll do with this. One of the things with the characters like these is you can't actually sort of ask them politely to keep it clean. So I'm very curious as to see what they'll actually come up with. I figured they'd give us our share of abuse, but that's more like it. We don't have any questions while we're at it, too. We can fill a lot of time on this end as well. There is. They've done this. They've done this periodically, and it is somewhat sort of generic. It is sort of. This is the. They do this periodically every couple of months, and I remember the last one they did it. It's basically their pacing is really interesting. Sometimes there'll be a flurry of activity, of course, where they tell sort of a narrative story, and then sometimes it'll go dead for a while. I mean, at various points, Wise Kaplan has been like kidnapped by a Russian heiress and made part of her like retinue of courtiers. At various times, my favorite is when he's like climbing buildings. He's jumped off the George Washington Bridge and been rescued by nuns after various suicide attempts. And so you'll see these sort of capsuled narratives that'll pop over time. And this is one of his stranger tropes, where it's basically like he'll sit down and tell you the wisdom of what it's like to be an editor. And and we'll like spit out something like 60 or 70 tweets in 2 hours or so. And so I hope they've been saving up good material here. I figured they'd be doing this a little bit faster, but yeah, it's just sort of interesting. I've never really had a chance to speak to them about their method, about how you sort of plot it out. And this is very much something they do as a labor of love. I mean, it isn't even a media property per se. Twitter owns every screen name, and you really can't own any of the content, as far as I know. That's a good question. I found him relatively early on. The question was the makeup of his followers. I found him relatively early on when it was very much media reporters and insiders, people who knew Peter Kaplan and worked with him. I worked with him for one story once and found him a great editor and one of the strangest people I'd ever worked with. And that's actually a real piece of advice. And so it spread out from there. Slate did a story on Wise Kaplan and Cranky Kaplan, and it sort of started to spread from there. And what's interesting is that the three characters somewhat really sort of correspond. Real Kaplan apparently started a whole bet with them that they would kill off one of the two characters, whichever was less popular, Wise Kaplan or Cranky Kaplan. And Wise Kaplan lost, but here he is today. So, but it's been interesting to see it sort of spread out beyond a sort of New York media in-joke. I think he's got something like 10 or 11,000 followers now. See, this is what I'm talking about. But it is, it's this sort of, fascinating, profane character. The best one he's been doing recently is he's walking around being like, I wonder if I could kill a guy. wait, no, that doesn't mean I want to kill a guy. Well, I love this guy. Why would I want to kill him? And then, of course, he's killed a guy. They've said that, that cranky Kaplan is the sort of loud, angry, obvious one, but that wise Kaplan is sort of like, the dangerous one, the quiet one. But, they really sort of think of them as distinct people with distinct personalities, and, and really sort of pioneered this whole notion of following all these fake people online. Well, I mean, to me, this is really interesting. I mean, this is something very new and very old. I mean, I think this is sort of, what this is sort of goes back to the, throwback to chatbots, really. I mean, this is sort of, this is interesting. This is two human beings who are typing this, but I mean, there's lots of bots out there on Twitter already that are already communicating. I could see very interesting AIs that could basically sort of carry on as real characters. And, you sort of have your stream of entertainers who are sort of, spitting out these visions. Well, yeah, that's sort of a classic version of the Turing test. I mean, the notion of is this, can this, AI pass itself off as a real human being? And what's really interesting, I wish I could find it, or maybe I should find it at lunch break, is someone recently paired up two chatbots to chat each other, and they couldn't figure it out. I don't even know what that one is. But they recently paired up chatbots to see what happens if the chatbots can figure it out, or whether they just sort of play it straight. And of course, they did play it straight, and it turned into this weird recursive loop of the chatbots sort of going down the drain. Possibly, I don't know. We can take a vote, Larry. Well, the question is, what don't you get about it? I guess is my question. Well, I mean, the point is, it's just a diversion. It's an entertainment of it. But I find it interesting in the sense of, the fact that this is based on the real Peter Kaplan. The fact that this is sort of, oh, that's my. Oh, you do need to know Peter Kaplan, but I think you can enjoy it to some extent in the sense of the notion of the creation of this character. In terms of how they find the time to do it, I have no idea. They are very productive writers. I mean, they're both working full-time jobs. But see, that's a great in-joke there. Two of the honey traps a journalist needs to avoid are Jarvis and Murdoch. I mean, that's a put-down of Jeff Jarvis, the digital journalism gadfly, and of course, Rupert Murdoch. Uh-huh.
And I think one thing that really makes it more compelling is when you've got, you Twitter up and you're also following the news, and what you're seeing is the connection between the two, which obviously isn't.
Yeah. Well, real Kaplan doesn't tweet as much, although that was very much a pleasure of. I'd say that one just strikes me as true. But it's interesting. But Miguel de Blumbito was very much a case where I mean, it's been interesting watching fake Twitter personalities spawn around news events, and then of course they quickly vanish away. Because the Bronx Zoo Cobra also spawned the Bronx Zoo Cobra Caper, and so there was a whole story being played out with two different personalities. And then I think a peacock escaped, and then that became a character as well. And so you suddenly had this sort of whole story being played out by characters on Twitter. Does someone have an idea what that top one means? Because I like it, but I don't actually know what that means. Yes?
Work decontextualized from the rest of the feed or of your own personal feed or the real world, which is why in the book version of the fake...
Come on down here, John. You talk to them for a while. Considering this is John Tova, ladies and gentlemen, CTO of Chicago, who was DJing at Mayor Emanuel's party. So I'm telling the story. But here, please, you talk about it.
Well, the book itself actually is annotated with what was going on as these tweets were coming in, because I think just a compendium of the fake tweets would I mean, it's funny actually, but the real narrative drive of that fake account was how it was, just slightly off center with, the real mayor candidate who was tweeting, but then other things that were going on. So if this is a new form of narrative, and I actually believe it is. I've never followed this account, though. It gets its drama from a tension with the other things that are happening in your feed.
Mayoral candidate Rahm Emanuel had been that the courts had decided that he really was a Chicago
Resident.
Mm-hmm. Because I was following the Rahm Emanuel Twitter feed, and it said street legal, bitches, and I'm like, yes. And then I went to the news. So
Call it the Daily Show effect or something like that. I mean, it had 10 times the number of followers as the real mayoral candidate. And it wasn't false. It was in some ways like what you hoped our candidates were thinking, but would never say.
Sort of like what you assume the real face is behind the very polished public face. Like, you've got.
It was like it was the id. You were relishing and enjoying the id of Mayor Manuel. Like it's like you imagine the internal monologue of Mayor Manuel.
Quaxelrod, the duck, who was sort of that version of David Axelrod, and Carl the intern, because we've always known Carl the intern. And so it did sort of bring you into the world in a way that, this is starting to, but we'll get it more when we go home and follow.
Well, yeah, and that's sort of, to me, that's sort of interesting, because that's sort of like the pleasures of fiction and nonfiction. I mean, like Mayor Emanuel is like a sort of a commentary on fiction, nonfiction. What I find interesting about Wise Kaplan is he's invented his own characters. He has Fat Billy the intern who does his various things, and my favorite trope of his is that what I love sort of as character is he constantly talks about the new style girls, in which he trademarks. And the new style girls are like totally, it's part of his whole throwback manner where he expects dames and broads. And so the new style girls are all the hipster girls who work in his office, because Wise Kaplan also sort of works at the real Peter Kaplan's job in his own mind. And so he's constantly sort of being bedeviled by all these hyper-empowered, ironic hipster women. And so built in is this sort of weird gender commentary where where he's basically terrified of them is the thing you pick up on it.
People to be caustic in an age when we've all been neutralized for a while. So you've got all of these alternate forms of expression that allow you to be the caustic person you might really be.
Well,
Is that what Lisa just talked about?
I was going to say, that's a very good question. And with that, since we're 16 minutes into this talk, I think it's perhaps time for a Q&A with the others. So if Lisa, you want to come up, and if Lee wants to come up, let's chat amongst ourselves. I told them we'd be doing Q&A simultaneously, and I'll let Lisa answer that question. So.